Finally, we are finally back. The football season is back upon us. The Premier League kicks off this weekend when Liverpool face Bournemouth, and it's been a long time coming. It's felt like an age. But let's talk about what I think could happen throughout 25-26. Ciao a tutti, welcome back to the Let's Talk Football podcast, and we're going to be taking a dive into a preview of the upcoming Premier League season that's set to kick off this weekend. And I thought, instead of giving you a dull 1 to 20, who I think will finish where, what surprises there could be in the table, I thought let's put a little bit of a different spin on it and take you through some of the main narratives, the key themes that I think could appear or that already exist and could leak into the upcoming campaign. Now, I think the first one and the most intriguing topic for a lot of fans, a lot of the media, and a lot of the spectators is the title race. Will we be having a wide open title race? Will it be a wide open scrap, talks of 3-4 teams being involved, a lot of business being done in this summer transfer window? Now, I think the general consensus has been Liverpool are the favourites, and I would agree. I think they've had an exceptional summer window. They've addressed some of their main issues from last season, and they have found replacements for some of the players who have departed, the likes of Trent Alexander-Arnold. They brought in Jeremy Frimpong from Bayer Leverkusen. Now, I've got some mixed thoughts on Liverpool and what I think could happen this season. We know recently there's been a lot of talk about Alexander Isak. Will that move happen? It seems like it's a bit of an ongoing saga as to whether they will get the Swede. But I think bringing in Hugo Ekitike, I think he looks really promising. Florian Wirtz, we know he's a top quality player who's had a really successful period at Leverkusen and already showed glimpses of his quality in the Community Shield against Crystal Palace last Sunday. I think bringing in Milos Kerkez, I think, is a really good addition. I think he's very like for like with Andy Robertson, and I think, though, being that similar in profile, I think really suits Liverpool. Obviously going up and down, bombing forward, having that athleticism to go both ways. And he looks like he's got that intensity to replace Robertson, who obviously will still play a prominent part in Liverpool's season. Now, for me, there are a couple of issues with Liverpool and where I expect them to go this season. And despite them bringing in Ekitike, obviously they still have Salah, who was phenomenal last season. I do expect Salah to have a slight drop-off. Now, that could still be a top season for him by his standards. With the amount he exerted last season, we saw him tail off just a touch towards, especially in the second half of the season. I was thinking about it yesterday, and I feel, especially in the big games in the second half of the season, I don't think he was quite as effective as he was in the first half of the season. I feel the last big performance he had in a game of real significance was when Liverpool went to the Etihad and beat them 2-0, beat City 2-0, and he was fantastic in that game. As I remember, I think Ekitike is a really good addition, but obviously inadvertently and unexpectedly losing Diogo Jota and that tragic situation, they could have never have planned for that. Now, moving on from Luis Diaz, moving on from Darwin Núñez, has brought in great funds, but I don't know whether the sole addition of Isak would be able to compensate for both of them. I think the depth will be really lacking in forward areas. Now, it looks like they could be losing Harvey Elliott as well, which wouldn't help. They've obviously got a few youngsters coming through in those areas. Sorry, I didn't want to mention his name. I feel like I'd butcher it, but who looked really promising in pre-season. I think just having Gakpo, Ekitike and Salah, I don't believe I'm missing anyone out, especially for those front three positions in the forward areas. I don't anticipate Wirtz to be playing in one of those three positions, at least regularly. I think he will slot right into midfield and play in that advanced role. I'm not too convinced. Obviously, they have Chiesa as well, but he's been linked with the move away all summer, and I'm not sure where he would fit in. Now, that would be a problem, I think, for Arne Slot. I think one of the reasons why they were so effective in front of goal last season wasn't just because of Salah's brilliance, but because of the depth in numbers they had. And listen, I'll be the first to tell you, I don't think any of the other attackers that they had at their disposal last season, in Núñez, in Diaz, in Jota, in Gakpo, were anywhere close to the level Salah got to. And I don't think they had to be, considering how exceptional Salah was. But I think not having those players to rely on to chip in 7, 10, 12, 15 goals across a season. We saw Núñez chip in with important goals. Even, we can lament about his inconsistencies and his rawness. Diaz being a really consistent performer across the season. Gakpo having his best year in the Liverpool shirt. And I think not having those numbers to rely on, or that strength in depth to look to, when perhaps Salah, who I don't think will be able to reach those numbers. Again, listen, he's been doubted before. He could go on to prove me wrong and score 45 goals. For me, I just cannot see it happening, particularly with him being, I believe, 33 now, 34. He will eventually decline. It may be a slow decline, but he will eventually drop off in his level. That is to be expected. It catches up with everyone. It caught up with Messi and it caught up with Ronaldo eventually. So it may not be this season. He may still score 20 goals in the league and have a really efficient year, but I think that may be a potential issue for Arne Slot. We've seen him lament, and I think very interestingly, with how Liverpool have acted since from the Community Shield, Arne Slot lamenting about his defensive options, how open they were, how many chances they conceded, and comparing it to last season's record. I think their intentions and their attitude since has been really purposeful in looking at getting 2 centre-halves in. We're obviously looking at getting Leone in from Parma, who's more of a one for the future, and Mark Gahey, who to me will definitely contend with Konate to start. Konate has had his injury issues, and I think that was the most important area for Liverpool since that Community Shield, and I think since last season, to focus on, considering they lost Jarell Quansah. And I don't quite think they had strong enough options in that central defensive area to cover for a potential Van Dijk injury, who we know is very consistently available, but Konate isn't and Joe Gomez isn't, who is a decent option to have, but consistently over, I'm not sure, 8 to 10 games, I'm not sure how high of a level he could attain and maintain. So I think that's an area that Liverpool are addressing, and I think that may not be an issue come in the next few weeks, for example. Talking about the contenders, who I think will be up there, obviously, I think Arsenal, I think by default in a way, will have to be there, and I think they will be. I think their squad is very good. I think as it currently stands, I think they do have a bit more balance than Liverpool do. That could obviously change, as I've just mentioned, with the defensive options. I think the additions Arsenal have made have been good. Something is just nagging at me with Arsenal and their transfer business. I'm not entirely sure why they've not gone all out for a left winger. And they've brought in Gyökeres, and there were a lot of complaints and a lot of concerns last season, and rightly so, with Arsenal's attacking options, Saka being injured, and I think their over-reliance on him from previous seasons was very apparent, especially when he came back and he hit the ground running straight away. I just think bringing in Gyökeres, he's still a bit of an unknown as to whether he will just be a straight success or whether it will need him a few games and a few weeks to acclimate to the Premier League. We know the difference in quality and intensity from the Portuguese League to the Premier League. Listen, he could go on to score 25 goals and be a huge success, and that has a good chance of happening considering the quality of players he will be around. I wonder whether Arteta and Arsenal will rue not going for someone of a Leao or a Rodrigo, who are really pushed for Arsenal to go for, because he has that star quality, that game-breaking ability to go and win you a game just out of nothing. I think Saka does have that. But I think if they're going to just continue to over-rely on that right-hand side, I think teams will figure it out and they will, come up with systems, come up with strategies to slow that down, to slow that threat down. We know how good Saka can be, and I think he will be back to his best next season. Ødegaard was very poor last season by his standards, and I'm not sure whether he has that consistent ability to be that man from midfield to create those chances. Arsenal did struggle to create chances, and I think that was a lot of that was down to Saka's injury and to Martin Ødegaard's drop in performance. I really like the Martin Zubimendi signing. I think he will be a great addition. I think he's going under the radar a little bit in terms of the difference he will make to that midfield. I think his ability to retain possession, his ability to break lines, his composure, I think in the big games, in the toughest atmospheres in the Premier League will be of massive importance. And I think it will allow Rice just to be a bit freer going forward. And obviously Christian Norgard to help, with a bit of depth there. And I think that was a very astute bit of business from Arsenal. I want to reiterate, I think they've done good business. I just don't know whether that business will take them over the edge. I was never of the opinion that a striker was all they needed to get him over the edge. I always thought bringing in like a world-class left winger, it would have made more of a difference. Listen, don't get me wrong, I do think they needed a striker. I don't think Kai Havertz solely was enough. I don't think he's the right profile to win the Premier League, even though he was very valuable to Arsenal in seasons gone by. And he looks like he's come back, bigger. He looks like he's come back stronger. He looks sharper. So maybe he'll add that to his game and be a bit more clinical in front of goal. But I don't know, there's something not quite clicking for me, at least, with Arsenal. I'm just not sure whether they will be able to get over the line. And ultimately, this is now or never for Arteta. This is the season. I think it doesn't have to be the Premier League. I think they would either have to win the Champions League or, go deep into the cup competitions. But I think the Premier League is the one they've wanted, and I think it's the one that Arteta will need to, really affirm what he's done at Arsenal. I think he's done a really, really good job. But I think it's now gotten to the point where it's now time to win. They have spent a lot of money, and they've spent well in some areas. But I think it's time for Arteta to make that next step if he is going to. And I think by default, they have to challenge and they have to really put up a fight to Liverpool this season. Moving on to other challenges, I think City will be in that discussion. I think the only thing bugging me with City is I really thought their business early in the window was really good, and I think the speed they were moving at was really impressive and going under the radar. Whether Guardiola has that same hunger to, go back to the top with City and, return them above Liverpool, I'm not sure. I think defensively they really do worry me. Rodri's out again for a further few weeks. I think until September, and I think that should be a real concern. I think if he came back, obviously he came back in the Club World Cup and he's been getting minutes. I think if he came back and slowly got back into the swing of things in the Premier League, got more consistent minutes, I think some sort of his level would have come back. But I think now getting another injury, another setback, it slows down his recovery. And listen, with time passing by, I just don't know whether Rodri will be the same player. Listen, I could be wrong and he could come back flying and make that difference like he always has. I think Reinders was a really excellent addition for City in that regard. I think he's a different profile to Rodri, and I think them together would have been a really impressive duo. But I'm not sure whether Reinders can play that 6 role, whether they'll have to play Nico Gonzalez there and integrate him a bit more. Obviously, having bought him in January, I believe, to offset the absence of Rodri, which will be needed again at the start of this season. I think the addition of Aït-Nouri is a good one and a needed one at left back. I think he's a really good player. I think their right back issues will be prominent this season. I'm not entirely convinced by Rico Lewis consistently to play there. We know he likes to play more centrally. Nunes, Guardiola has said he's better at right back. I'm not entirely convinced. He did show improvements at the tail end of last season in that position. I think Cherki will be a success. I think his creative abilities will be important to offset the loss of De Bruyne. But just on De Bruyne, I don't think a lot of people have spoken about it. And I think his impact and his influence on the City team will be very apparent this season. I don't just think in his creative work. I don't just think in his goal-scoring ability from midfield. His ability to get them up the pitch, so quickly. I think his leadership qualities and I think his ability to turn up in those big games. I think his performances in the biggest games under the most pressure really went under the radar in his City career. And I think that will be a massive loss for City this season if they are going to challenge. I don't think they'll be able to sustain it across the whole season with the defensive options they've got. Listen, they do still have Diaz and John Stones. I don't quite think they're at the level that they once were at. Kusanov still a bit of an unknown. Rice is still a bit of an unknown. So, I like Akanji. I think Vardiol will come into his own at centre-half more this season. So, listen, I could be very wrong, but it's just something not quite there with City yet defensively. Obviously, we've got this goalkeeper situation going on as well, whether they will bring in Donnarumma, which just doesn't feel like a City signing to me at all, considering the way they play. Donnarumma's, very sketchy with his feet and in possession. Listen, he has just had a brilliant season with PSG, but I just don't know whether that will be the right move for them. How will James Trafford feel about that? So, listen, a lot going on at City, and it just still feels a little chaotic to me heading into the season. Now, Chelsea, I feel, could be a dark horse. Now, when talking about the title, I feel the three I've just gone through, the three sides I've just, given my thoughts on, are the three main, challenges for the Premier League this season. I think with Liverpool being favourites, I don't think they're clear favourites like a lot of people have said. I think the business has been really good. Like with the issues I've mentioned, I think it will be closer than a lot of people are giving credit for. Let's talk about Chelsea because I think they're a very interesting subject this season. Now, I've seen opposite ends of the spectrum where some people may think they'll go on to challenge for the league. Some people think they're not quite there. Some people think that they could finish above City, and I'm in that boat. I think generally across the whole squad, I think it's a really impressive squad that they have built. Now, listen, there is still that element of chaos with their transfer business. I'm not quite sure how they're going to keep all of their attacking talent happy with the amount of additions they've made in those areas over the past 3-4 seasons. Talking of the business though, I do really like the additions they've made this summer, especially in the forward areas. Now, I think this could be a prominent story with Chelsea this season where they'll be exceptional going forward. I think they'll have a really, outstanding campaign in forward areas. They'll be really creative, dynamic to watch. They've got so much variety to work with, has Enzo Maresca. I think this could be the downfall though. I think they could be top heavy. And I think the improvements they showed last season, especially, the start of the year, there was talk of them, will they challenge for the title? And obviously they tailed off around Christmas time. Got back into the swing of things to finish fourth. I think they'll be too top heavy, and I think the weaknesses defensively, especially with the central options and in net, I think will be a real issue. I cannot comprehend or understand why they did not go in for Mike Maignan properly and they didn't get that deal done. Because Robert Sanchez is not good enough for me. He's not a good enough goalkeeper to win you a Premier League. He's too susceptible to errors. He doesn't bring his backline confidence. He doesn't bring his whole team confidence. He's not commanding enough. And I think those three attributes alone that he's lacking will cost Chelsea too many points this season. And I think I really like the full-back options. I think Gusto, Reece James are really, two real options, to switch between, rotate between, especially now with the Champions League. I think Cucurella had a real standout year last season in Chelsea colours. Whether they'll be struggling for depth there, I'm not entirely sure, but I think their midfield is one of the best in the Premier League. I think, Moise Caicedo had an outstanding season in 24-25, one of the best in the league, really establishing himself, at a top club. I think Enzo Fernandez showed real improvement in the second half of the season. I think, Cole Palmer had an off year by his standards, but we saw his star quality shine through more at the end of the season in those important games. It brings me back to the Conference League final where he really shone in the Club World Cup final in those knockout games. I think he was, he really showed his importance to Chelsea, and I think he could be due an outstanding season this campaign if he can get that continuity back and those consistent levels back from a few seasons ago. Colwill is the talent, and I think he's got good attributes. I think he's got too many mistakes in him, and I just don't think Chelsea have that outstanding centre-half option that a Liverpool do or that an Arsenal do per se, and that goalkeeper that really provide the rest of the team with that solidarity, that compactness, that defensive strength that those other contenders do. And I think that just ultimately will be the downfall unless they do address it in these final few weeks of the window. But I think they're due a really good season, Chelsea. I think they will give a good test to the likes of Arsenal and Liverpool at the top end of the season. I think it will be close between them and City for those third and fourth, but I just ultimately think they will edge it because of the additions in João Pedro, who I think is an excellent player. I think Liam Delap's a really good addition. I think they've got a real good variety across the front line now, especially in that central area. Whether Nicholas Jackson will now go, I'm not too sure. But I think they will be better off keeping three of them and having those different profiles and options and different ways of setting up in different games. I think that will really help Enzo Maresca. And I really like Jamie Gittins. I think he's a really nice addition for that left wing position. I think Neto, is a good player. I think he will improve this season, and the rest of their attacking talents, whether they get Xavi Simons in, I think he would be a really astute pickup for them to help offset that over-reliance on Cole Palmer a little bit. And I think that was very prominent last season, especially when his performances tailed off. So that is where I stand on, those top 4 or 5 positions this season. Now, I just wanted to pivot to the rest of the big 6 per se, and where I think we could see improvements and what I think of the general consensus of where they will finish. Tottenham and United. Now, this is a very interesting talking point heading into this season for many different reasons. One, of course, of how poor both were last season. Disastrous seasons for both Manchester United and Tottenham last year, 15th and 17th respectively, under Ruben Amorim and Ange Postecoglou. Now, things have changed at Tottenham. Obviously beating United to the Europa League last season, bringing in Thomas Frank, who's an excellent coach, did a brilliant job in the 8 seasons at Brentford. Now he's ready to take that step up to a big 6 club, to that top level. Whether he'll be able to cope, I'm still unsure of that. And I think this could be a problem for Tottenham, especially dealing with the Champions League. I don't think they have the squad for it. I think the positions both clubs finished in were massive outliers. I don't think will happen again to that extent. Do I think United and Spurs will just jump back into the top 5, top 6? That is hard for me to say. Though, just touching on Tottenham first, I like the addition of Kudus. I think he's a top player, and I think he had a little off season last year with West Ham, but I think he'd be a really dynamic addition to a front line with Solanke, who I think is due a big season. I think he needs to deliver more so than he did last year. I think Brennan Johnson showed flashes at the start of the season in 24-25, but he tailed off. Maddison now injured. Kulusevski was excellent for parts of last season before he got injured. Losing Son, how will that affect them? The lack of leadership, for example. Will they be able to keep the majority of the players fit? These are all unknowns, and I think questions Thomas Frank will need to address. Do I think they will improve? Yes. I think they will be in the top 10 this year, Tottenham. I think I've seen a lot of discourse and a lot of anticipation for Spurs to finish 5th, 6th. And for me, I can't see it. I don't think the squad is as good as people make out. I think they have some very good players, especially in attacking areas. I think Van de Ven and Romero need to stay fit this year. I think they form a very solid pairing centrally in defence. I think Pedro Porro's a good player. I think they are lacking a little bit at left back. Vicario for me is a little bit of an unknown. I think he was very good in his first year under Ange Postecoglou, but very inconsistent last season and made too many errors. I do think Frank will bring that, that defensive, the tactically defensively they will be much better Tottenham. I'm not sure how Frank and this group will be able to cope with the Champions League consistently and be able to contend with looking to improve in the Premier League. Frank now has to face the added pressure of and expectations of going far in multiple different competitions. You've got to remember this. It's such a jump from Brentford to Spurs. The expectations, the pressures, the goals for the season, what the fans will expect of him. Now, listen, I don't think Thomas Frank is particularly under massive pressure, but I do think he will face pressure, obviously, like he's never seen at Brentford. And I think just the Champions League European football aspect, I think, will be tough for Tottenham and Frank to deal with. Though I do foresee improvement from Spurs. Let's move on to United, who... Listen, this is a very tough subject for me to talk about, obviously, as a fan, and I completely tried to remove any bias, any subjectivity there. I look to try and be as objective as possible and just look at the facts and what I think could happen. Now, I think like a lot of United fans, I think that I'm optimistic. I like to be as optimistic as possible for how the season will go. I do think the maximum United could finish is around 6th. Now, I think 5th at a very like an extreme push. These are my reasons why. I think the lack of European football was damaging in a lot of ways for United last season and for this season. But I think the lack of European football will be a massive help for Ruben Amorim. Not coming off the back of his first pre-season with the team, we've seen improvements. Some areas that still need working on, but I think we've seen improvements in the structure, in the pressing. Obviously, with the additions of Matheus Cunha, Brian Mbeumo, Benjamin Sesko in the forward line, and we'll see massive improvements going forward there with Bruno Fernandes behind him. Kobbie Mainoo, I think, will have a big season. I think Patrick Dorgu the same. I think we just have a more settled unit, and I think it's a much more likeable team than we've seen last season and in years prior. The problem is for me right now, and a lot of what bases my preview for Manchester United this season is in this midfield, and I think it's a massive hole in this squad. I'm not particularly fond of any of the pairings we could put together in that midfield too that Ruben Amorim likes to play in this system, and I think obviously there's heavy links with Carlos Baleba from Brighton right now, and I think he's exactly the type of profile we do need. I think the price that Brighton are going to ask will be a problem. I'm not sure whether Ineos will want to go as high as 100 million. That's been going around, that's being quoted. But I think it's that important of an area for Manchester United to address. And I'll be honest, I'm surprised they've not addressed it sooner. If we do get him in, I think that could see Manchester United have a really good season. And I think, surprise a lot of people considering how bad they were last year. And listen, I understand the perspective of other media and fans when they think United will finish, 11th, 12th, 9th, 10th. And I think that could also be realistic based on how bad we were. But I do think Spurs and United's finishing positions last year were outliers. I think a lot of teams overperformed as well. The likes of Bournemouth, I think Brentford will struggle this season without Thomas Frank. Obviously, Forest definitely overperformed, so I think there will be a drop-off there. So I do think United and Spurs both will improve. It's just how much will they improve? and the different aspects of both clubs, the situations they're both going into. With Ruben Amorim and Thomas Frank is very up in the air right now, and I think it will be fascinating to see this season. Who do I think will overperform this season? And listen, I think, and you can question whether this is an overperformance, but I think it certainly is considering where they've come from. I think Leeds United will stay up, and I think it's a really interesting subject, this with the promoted sides, obviously with this nasty trend that's been going on in the Premier League with the 3 promoted teams always going down. I think it's happened the last 2 or 3 years consecutively now, with Leeds United, Sunderland and Burnley coming up, who all have good history in the league. I think Leeds are the most likely to stay up, and I think it's more so for the reasons of experience with Daniel Farke. Now, I've seen mixed opinions about his management and whether he will survive until December, but I think, I really like some of the business they've done. You know, Lucas Mecha, I think that's how you pronounce it. I think is a really astute deal for free. I think B Hall from Udinese is a really good addition defensively. I like the fact that they've not gone gung-ho after coming up. I think a lot of people have tipped Sunderland to come up because of how much business they've done and particularly the Granit Xhaka deal. I just think historically when promoted teams have spent so much and changed around the team from the one that got promoted, I think it does affect them chemistry-wise. It does affect how they play together in the Premier League, and I think it gives them the idea that they can go into the Premier League and play nice football. I think the way to go for promoted teams is to be more pragmatic. And I think that's what Leeds will do. I think Farke has the experience in the Premier League. And I think this time around it could be, a big improvement for Leeds United. And I think they will just about stay in the Premier League. I think it will be close. But I do think one of the existing Premier League teams will go down. Now, moving on to my underperformers, and now there were quite a few options for this, and you could go for Man United again. What is an underperformance for them? You could go for Spurs again. Nottingham Forest, based on last season, but with how much they overperformed and other teams underperformed, could you describe that as an underperformance? So for me, I'm going to go big. I'm going to go Newcastle. And the main point being this Isak drama. And listen, there are other points that I will get into. I just think this Alexander Isak drama has turned so sour and it feels toxic to me at this moment in time. I think everyone's on edge at the club. I think the manager's on edge. Whenever you hear him in interviews, he's consistently asked about this and what's going to happen. Will he reintegrate him into the squad? The reports are that Isak doesn't want to be reintegrated. And I think the way Isak has gone about it to this point hasn't been particularly brilliant. I think ultimately he and his representatives informed the club way too late of his desire to leave. Liverpool at the time had already bought Ekitike, Arsenal had already bought Gyökeres, who were the two main clubs that were going after Isak, and I think it would have been very different if he had informed them at the end of last season. And I just think there's a way to go about it. I think there's a more amicable way for a player to inform the club of his desire to leave, and I think just the way he's kind of kicked up a fuss and been isolated, I think just doesn't bode well for any of the parties involved in Liverpool, in Newcastle and in the player. So I just think I worry for Newcastle whether that could leak into their season, and I think it could affect the team morale and the team cohesiveness, and I think that's such a massive part of Newcastle and how good they were last season. And in the seasons gone by under Eddie Howe, I think that cohesiveness and the crowd getting behind them, and I just think it could start off the season with a little bit of a sour taste no matter what happens. And I think ultimately it would be better off for Newcastle for Isak to go. I don't think it would bode well for Newcastle, a team who are so heavily reliant on that emotional connection with their fan base, particularly at St James's Park. Now, I'm also not too fond of the business they've done or the lack of. I think bringing in Elanga, who's had a very good season at Nottingham Forest, I'm not entirely sure whether that was the right area of priority for them. Listen, they obviously found out late about Isak, supposedly and reportedly. And I think that's not necessarily their fault. I think time is running out for them to find a suitable replacement for Isak. And will they be able to replace that impact and those goals and that clinicality in front of goal? I'm not entirely sure. In fact, I just don't think so. I think we know they've been linked with Vissa. They were interested in Česko. They couldn't get him over the line. So I think it's going to be a difficult period, especially at the start of the season for Newcastle. And listen, we know Eddie Howe's a top coach and he can get more out of means that he has at his disposal. I just think depth-wise, competing in the Champions League, more games now with this format than when they were in it a few seasons ago, could see Newcastle struggle this season. Now, by underperforming, I think based on the last few seasons where they've got into the Champions League in 2 of the last 3 years, I do think it could be around 8th or 9th for Newcastle this season. But those are my final thoughts on the Premier League this season. And I hope you enjoyed this twist on it and a little bit of a different point of view on various different topics heading into the season, the different storylines that we could see. And I'm so excited for the season to begin. It's been too long without, proper competitive football in England. So let's hope for an amazing start this weekend. And I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Let's Talk Football podcast. And I will see you in the next one. Ciao.